A stained scrap of silk sat in a cardboard box for over 100 years, passed between relatives who half believed it was cursed and half believed it was worthless. Nobody tested it. Nobody wanted to. And then, in a quiet lab in Liverpool, a scientist ran a swab across an old brown stain and pulled out something that had been hiding inside it since the autumn of 1888. A signature written in blood that may finally answer the question London could never solve. Not a duke. Not a doctor. Not a secret society. Something far stranger, a name the police already had, sitting in their own files the whole time, while the world went looking for a monster grand enough to fit the crime. To understand why that myth grew so large, you have to picture the place it was born in. Whitechapel in 1888 was one of the most overcrowded, impoverished corners of the largest city on earth. Families were packed into single rooms. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Many of the women who lived there survived by moving between casual labor, occasional prostitution, and a nightly scramble for a few pennies to pay for a bed in a lodging house. The streets were narrow, poorly lit, and often choked with the thick coal smoke fog Londoners called a pea souper, fog so dense that people could lose sight of a companion walking beside them. It was, in almost every sense, the ideal hunting ground for someone who wanted to disappear the moment the act was done. And the police who were supposed to stop him had almost nothing to work with. There was no fingerprinting yet, that wouldn't become standard investigative practice in Britain for more than a decade. There was no forensic laboratory capable of doing anything with a bloodstain beyond confirming that it was, in fact, blood. Detectives worked with eyewitness accounts, foot patrols, and instinct, against a killer who structured his attacks around exactly those blind spots. Scotland Yard was flooded with tips, false confessions, and wild theories, fed by a newspaper industry that had just discovered how much money a serial killer could sell in print. Out of that flood came hundreds of suspects, and not one conviction. The case went cold, and then it went further than cold, it went into legend. That's the part worth sitting with for a second, because it explains everything that happened next. When a mystery this violent has no ending, people don't just lose interest, they start inventing one. Over the following century, Jack the Ripper was reimagined as a royal physician, a crazed painter, a Freemason protecting the throne, even, in one theory, a member of the royal family itself. Each version was more elaborate than the last, and each one shared a common thread: the killer had to be extraordinary. Powerful. Educated. Someone whose identity, once revealed, would feel as dramatic as the crimes themselves. The alternative, that he might simply have been an unremarkable, mentally unwell man who lived 2 streets over from his victims, was somehow less satisfying, even though it was, from the very beginning, exactly what a number of the original investigators suspected. That's the twist buried at the center of this story. The Victorian police were not simply flailing in the dark the way pop culture likes to imagine. Senior officers on the case quietly compiled their own short list of suspects, based on local knowledge, behavior, and circumstantial detail that never made it into the newspapers. One name on that list belonged to a Polish Jewish immigrant in his mid-20s named Aaron Kosminski, who worked as a barber in the heart of Whitechapel, and who several officers, in private notes years apart, pointed to as their leading suspect. He never stood trial. He was never publicly named as a suspect in his own lifetime. He simply disappears from most retellings of the case, because a poor local barber doesn't make for much of a headline compared to a hidden prince. For well over a century, that's where things stood, a name in a margin, a memo in a drawer, and no way to test whether either of them meant anything. Then, in 2007, a British author and self-described Ripper enthusiast named Russell Edwards bought a piece of stained silk at auction, a shawl with a strange and unverified backstory attached to it. According to family tradition passed down for generations, the shawl had been picked up at the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder by a police officer who, for reasons nobody can fully explain, took it home instead of logging it as evidence. It stayed in that family for well over 100 years, folded away, unphotographed, untested, treated by most serious historians as just another piece of what Ripper researchers call Ripana, the flood of dubious relics, letters, and trinkets that have attached themselves to this case like barnacles over the decades. Edwards believed otherwise, and he had the resources to test that belief. He partnered with Dr. Jori Louhelainen, a molecular biologist at Liverpool John Moores University, whose specialty is exactly this kind of impossible case, pulling usable genetic material out of samples that are old, degraded, and by any reasonable standard dead. The shawl he was given to work with had spent well over 100 years being folded, unfolded, stored, and handled by generations of relatives, with no idea they were preserving potential evidence. Every one of those years and every one of those hands was, in genetic terms, working against him. The team's strategy was to go after mitochondrial DNA rather than the nuclear DNA most people picture when they think of genetic testing. It's a smart workaround for old, damaged samples, and it's worth understanding why. Every cell in the human body carries hundreds, sometimes thousands, of mitochondria, and each one carries its own small loop of DNA separate from the DNA in the cell's nucleus. Because there are so many copies floating around in a single cell, mitochondrial DNA tends to survive in degraded samples long after nuclear DNA has broken down, which makes it one of the only realistic tools available when you're trying to read something as old and abused as a Victorian shawl. The other thing that makes mitochondrial DNA useful here is how it's inherited. Unlike nuclear DNA, which is a shuffled combination of both parents, mitochondrial DNA passes down only through the maternal line, mother to child, generation after generation, essentially unchanged for centuries. That means a living person today can, in theory, share a detectable mitochondrial signature with a distant ancestor, as long as the line of descent runs entirely through women. It's not a fingerprint in the way DNA evidence usually works in a modern courtroom. It's shared by everyone who descends from the same maternal line, which can be a very large group of people. But for a case with no living suspect and no modern crime scene, it was the only bridge available across 130 years. Before the team could even think about identifying a killer, they had to answer a more basic question: was this shawl actually at the murder scene, or was it just an old piece of fabric with a good story attached to it? To test that, researchers tracked down a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes' sister, tracing an unbroken maternal line down through the generations using birth records, marriage records, and census documents. They took a simple cheek swab from her and compared it against genetic material extracted from bloodstains on the shawl. According to the published research, the sequences matched. If that result holds up, it would mean the shawl really was present at the scene of Eddowes' murder, which, for a piece of Ripana that historians had dismissed for a century, was already a remarkable finding on its own. That's where the story could have ended, as a fascinating footnote about a piece of textile history finally being authenticated. But the researchers reported finding more than just the victim's blood on the shawl. Mixed in among the stains, they identified biological material they interpreted as consistent with semen, which, if genuine, and if correctly dated to the crime itself, would suggest the person responsible for the attack left more than just violence behind that night. The team extracted a second mitochondrial profile from that material, one they believed belonged not to the victim, but to her killer. A profile isn't a name, though. To turn it into one, the researchers needed a comparison sample from a living descendant of a plausible suspect, and this is where the story loops back to that overlooked memo from the original investigation. Using genealogical research, the team traced a maternal line down from a relative of Aaron Kosminski, the Whitechapel barber, whose name had sat quietly in police files for well over a century, largely ignored by a public that wanted its killer to be someone grander. They located a living descendant, took a sample, and compared it to the second genetic profile pulled from the shawl. According to the 2019 paper published by Louhelainen and co-author David Miller in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, that comparison also produced a match. If you're waiting for a satisfying villain reveal, Aaron Kosminski is almost aggressively ordinary, and that's precisely what makes him plausible rather than cinematic. He was a Polish Jewish immigrant who had fled violent anti-Jewish pogroms in the Russian Empire, arrived in London's East End as a young man, and worked as a barber in the same crowded streets where the murders took place. Contemporary accounts and later research describe a man in serious mental decline, with behavior consistent with what modern psychiatry might describe as a severe psychotic disorder, auditory hallucinations, paranoia, and according to police notes from the time, an intense hatred directed at women. He was not a stranger passing through the neighborhood. He lived in it, walked the same alleys the victims did, and by multiple contemporaneous accounts, was already known to local officers as someone to watch. That's what makes the private notes left by two of the most senior investigators on the case so striking. Melville McNaughton, a chief constable, who joined the investigation shortly after the murders stopped, wrote an internal 1894 memorandum listing Kosminski among his top suspects, describing him as having strong homicidal tendencies and a hatred of women. Separately, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who had overseen the entire Ripper investigation from the beginning, is reported to have written a private annotation in his own copy of a colleague's memoirs years after retirement, naming Kosminski as the man he believed responsible. A note never intended for publication, discovered only decades later by his descendants. Neither man made that belief public in his lifetime. There was no trial, no formal charge, no forensic proof available to a Victorian police force. There was only a private conviction, tucked into the margins of a book. What happened to Kosminski afterward adds one more uncomfortable detail to the timeline. In 1891, his family, unable to manage or protect him any longer, had him committed to an asylum, where he remained until his death years later. And the murders that had terrorized Whitechapel for months stopped happening around the same period he was removed from the streets. That timing doesn't prove anything on its own, but it's the kind of coincidence that made him hard for the original investigators to dismiss. And it's part of why his name kept resurfacing in Ripper research long before anyone had DNA to test. Now for the honest part of this story, because a claim this large deserves real scrutiny rather than a triumphant bow. When the 2019 study was published, it did not settle the case the way the headlines suggested it might. Geneticists and Ripper historians raised serious, substantive objections. The Shaw's chain of custody is essentially non-existent for most of its history. It passed through a policeman's family, then generations of relatives, then collectors, then an auction house, then a private buyer, and finally a lab, all without ever being logged as evidence or stored under controlled conditions. Over more than a century of handling, folding, and storage, the opportunities for contamination are significant, and critics have pointed out that mitochondrial DNA, because it's shared across entire maternal lines rather than being unique to one person, isn't nearly as discriminating as the kind of DNA evidence used in a modern courtroom. A match doesn't rule out thousands of other people who share the same maternal lineage. The research team has also faced criticism for not publishing the complete underlying genetic data for outside labs to independently verify, which is normally considered essential before a scientific claim of this magnitude is treated as settled fact. So where does that leave us? Somewhere honest, if not entirely satisfying. This is a genuinely serious piece of forensic research, conducted by credentialed scientists, that adds real weight to a suspect the original investigators already believed in. But it falls short of the kind of ironclad, independently replicated proof that would close a case for good in a modern court of law. It's evidence, not a verdict. And in a mystery that has survived 137 years of theories, hoaxes, and half-truths, the strongest evidence yet might be as close to an ending as this story ever gets. What lingers longest, though, isn't the DNA at all. It's the memo in the margin. It's the fact that while the entire world spent a century imagining princes and secret societies, the men who actually walked those foggy streets in 1888, who knocked on the doors and knew the neighborhood, may have quietly known the truth the whole time, and simply had no way to prove it. If Aaron Kosminski really was the man behind those murders, then the most infamous unsolved case in criminal history wasn't unsolved at all. It was simply unproven, sitting in a police file and a private diary, waiting 130 years for science to catch up to what a handful of exhausted Victorian detectives already suspected.